I woke slowly, the sunlight spilling across my bedroom in the Chicago apartment I'd called home for the last 15 years. Today was my 64th birthday, a milestone that once would have meant little more than a card from my parents and maybe a call from Miranda. I stretched, expecting the familiar quiet, and reached for my phone. The screen lit up with notifications, Instagram mostly, but one caught my eye immediately. A series of photos posted just hours before showing a gathering of people smiling, balloons in pastel colors, a cake glimmering with candles. My heart sank as I realized the truth. My daughter Miranda had thrown a surprise party, but not for me. The celebration was for Janet, my daughter-in-law's mother, a woman I had exchanged polite greetings with only a handful of times. I scrolled through the photos, disbelief rooting me to the bed. Janet beamed as Miranda presented her with a layered cake. Family friends laughed and clinked glasses. Not a single image, not a single caption acknowledged me. I paused on a shot of my daughter leaning toward Janet with that familiar smile, the one she always reserved for others when I was present. The wave of hurt hit me fully. Then the quiet accumulation of years spent overlooked the small moments I had once excused to preserve harmony. I had supported Miranda through college, offered advice, lent money when needed, all without acknowledgement. And now this, the ostentatious celebration of someone else on my birthday, felt like a final punctuation mark in a long sentence of invisibility. I set my phone down on the nightstand, staring at the ceiling. A tightness settled in my chest, mingling with a reluctant clarity. Something had shifted, and I could feel it even in the quiet of the morning. Today would not be like the others, and the choice I made next would begin to change everything. As I sat on the edge of the bed, the images from Instagram still lingering in my mind, my thoughts drifted back decades to my earliest memories of family life in Chicago. I was always the responsible one. The child who remembered birthdays, kept track of schedules, and smoothed over arguments between siblings. While I managed homework chores and the household routines, my brother and younger cousins received the attention, praise, and indulgences that seemed to vanish whenever I tried to reach for the same recognition. I remembered my 10th birthday vividly. I had asked for a small gathering with classmates, nothing extravagant, just pizza and cake. By the morning, my plans had been shifted to accommodate my brother's new hobby, his dance class or sports practice. My birthday money became his registration fee, and the celebration for me was quietly postponed, eventually forgotten. Even then, I learned to swallow the disappointment and focus on making others happy. That lesson never left me. As an adult, the pattern persisted. I spent countless hours supporting Miranda, advising her on school, helping with rent, when she faced gaps in employment, quietly covering for oversights and emergencies that never made it into family conversations. I loaned money to relatives when they were behind on bills, drove across town to run errands for my daughter, and spent holidays organizing events that brought joy to everyone but me. Recognition rarely came, and when it did, it was perfunctory. The resentment simmered quietly, but it had grown heavier over the years. I had learned to accept being invisible, framing it as a choice to protect the family harmony. And yet, as I recalled all these moments, the small sacrifices, the overlooked achievements, I realized that my tolerance had been exploited. Generosity had been mistaken for weakness. Support had been assumed to be endless and unquestioning. That morning, sitting alone in my apartment, the pattern that had defined my life crystallized. It was not just about a missed birthday or a single party. It was about decades of being undervalued and overlooked. Something inside me had begun to shift, a quiet resolve stirring that today at 64, I might finally rewrite the rules I had been living by. I picked up my phone again, unable to resist the pull, even though every scroll tightened the knot in my chest. The party photos filled the screen. Pastel balloons arranged carefully across the living room, a table piled high with wrapped gifts, and a cake that looked far too extravagant for a quiet suburban gathering. Janet, my daughter's mother-in-law, stood at the center, her face radiant with delight, Miranda leaning close with that familiar, proud smile. Laughter and clinking glasses froze me in place, the cheerful scene cutting sharper than any words could. I lingered on a photo of Miranda presenting the cake, her eyes sparkling with pride for someone who was not me. My heart ached with disbelief. For years, I had quietly supported her, helped cover expenses, offered advice and guidance, and quietly corrected the messes she left behind. Every emergency I had quietly managed, every late rent payment I had covered, every holiday arrangement I had coordinated, none of it mattered here. Not one glance, not one word acknowledged me. The injustice of it built steadily simmering beneath the surface, and I realized how much of my life had been spent keeping the family afloat, while my own milestones passed with only polite nods or silent recognition. Now, in these photos, that pattern was laid bare. The party was not only a celebration of Janet, but also a stark reminder of all the birthday's achievements and quiet efforts of mine that had been ignored, overshadowed, or forgotten. I set my phone down on the nightstand, breathing slowly to steady myself. The hurt was there raw and unyielding, but beneath it a new clarity had begun to form. The betrayal was undeniable, and the pattern of neglect undeniable. Today had already started differently, and the momentum of what I had discovered would not fade. I sank into the armchair by the window, letting the morning light settle across the papers spread on my lap. Bank statements, receipts, old emails, all reminders of the years I had quietly carried the weight of the family's needs. Rent for Miranda's apartment, when her paychecks were late, utility bills for the unexpected outages, gifts for birthdays and holidays. I had helped coordinate even small loans to cover emergencies. They were all there, meticulously recorded, a ledger of invisible labor. The familiar ache of resentment rose again, but this time it carried a sharper edge. The Instagram photos had been a mirror, reflecting not just my daughter's thoughtlessness, but the cumulative pattern that had defined my life. The quiet rage began to coalesce into something steadier, a determination that had been dormant for far too long. I thought of the fear, the unease that always accompanied any assertion of authority within the family. Years of acquiescence had made resistance uncomfortable, and yet for the first time, the discomfort felt manageable, even justified. This was not about punishment or vengeance. It was about drawing a line, marking the boundary between what I would endure and what I would no longer tolerate. The ledger before me was more than numbers. It was proof that I had given beyond expectation, often without acknowledgement or gratitude. The question no longer lingered in doubt. It demanded action. I would no longer be the silent enabler, the overlooked caretaker. Something had shifted, and the path forward was clear, even if the consequences remained uncertain. I sat at the kitchen table, the morning light catching the edge of my laptop as I opened the online banking portal. For years, I had sent money quietly, month after month, covering rent, utilities, and small emergencies for Miranda, and indirectly, her mother-in-law. Each transfer was a reminder of the weight I carried, alone a responsibility that never earned acknowledgement, only assumption. Today, the pattern would change. My fingers hovered over the keyboard as I reviewed the automatic payment schedule. I had always justified these transfers as part of keeping the family afloat, a silent duty that ensured no one faced eviction or hardship. But the Instagram photos had shattered the pretense of gratitude. It was no longer about kindness or obligation. It was about preserving myself, I would no longer fund someone who had never recognized my sacrifices, who had allowed my presence to fade into background noise while celebrating the achievements of others. With careful precision, I altered the account settings, halting the next payment that would have gone to the apartment management company. I redirected the funds into my own savings, earmarked for a small vacation I had postponed for years, a reminder that I had a life separate from the demands of others. The act was simple but deliberate, a quiet declaration of autonomy. I imagined the consequences cascading Janet's confusion, Miranda's frustration, the inevitable questions. My mind raced through potential arguments, protests, and guilt trips. It did not frighten me. Instead, it solidified the clarity I had been building since the Instagram discovery. I would not back down. As I logged out and closed the laptop, a sense of resolve settled over me. This was the first step in reclaiming control, a tangible assertion that my needs mattered. The ripple effect was inevitable, and I welcomed it. Today marked the beginning of a shift in power, a recalibration of responsibility. After the transfer was complete, I sat back in my chair, letting the quiet settle around me, and reopened my ledger of past contributions. I had kept meticulous records of every dollar sent, every bill covered, every small emergency handled without question. It was meant as a reference for myself, a way to keep track of years spent supporting Miranda and indirectly Janet. But now, with the payments paused, curiosity mingled with apprehension. I needed to know if my sacrifices had been respected. I started cross-referencing bank statements with emails and messages, checking for any confirmations or receipts. What I found made my chest tighten. Notices intended for Janet had been redirected, bills left unpaid, deadlines ignored, money I had sent to cover essentials had instead gone to items that bore no relation to her supposed needs. The utility disconnection notices that should have triggered action had been ignored. Rent payments were late, repeatedly, despite the funds I provided. Everything was documented evidence that the support I had trusted was misused. A flicker of anger surged through me, but it was tempered by clarity. This was not simply neglect, it was exploitation. The pattern of being overlooked and taken for granted had extended into financial matters, years of silent support, feeding into a cycle that no one, not even Miranda, had acknowledged. As I dug further, I noticed a subtle thread Miranda might not have known the full extent. Some messages suggested her assumptions about Janet's needs were incomplete. She had participated out of habit, unaware of the deception, or at best only partially complicit. That realization added a complicated layer to the situation, a mixture of disappointment and strategy. Sitting in the quiet of my apartment, the ledger spread across the table, I felt the weight of empowerment settling in. The evidence was undeniable, the path forward clear. I would confront this situation not from anger alone, but from the unshakable certainty that boundaries needed to be drawn and responsibility demanded. The days following the transfer stretched uneasily. I went about my routine in Chicago, answering emails at the library, sipping coffee at the corner cafe, but my thoughts kept returning to the consequences I knew were coming. Every ping of my phone made me pause. Every notification, a potential sign that Janet or Miranda had noticed the change. It didn't take long. By the third day, a message appeared from Janet on my phone, her tone clipped and insistent. Vivian, the landlord, called. "What is going on?" It was followed by several more texts, alternating between frustration and veiled blame. Miranda reached out as well, though cautiously, as if unsure how to phrase her questions. Both were reacting to the shift I had initiated, and the tension in every message was palpable. I read and reread their words, letting the weight of them sink in. In the quiet of my apartment, I reflected on decades of silent sacrifice, the unpaid bills the holidays organized, the emergencies handled without acknowledgement. All of it had been absorbed without complaint, yet now I was simply reclaiming a measure of control. And suddenly, the family that had relied on me so heavily felt unsettled. The unease stirred a strange satisfaction within me. For the first time in years, I was not bending to maintain appearances or placate others. My decisions were deliberate, measured, and irrevocable. The fear that had always accompanied confrontation, the anxiety of angering Miranda, of disappointing family, was present, but tempered by the clarity of purpose. I spent the evening reviewing the ledger once more, anticipating the inevitable fallout while solidifying my resolve. Each message, each unanswered call was a reminder that this shift would force recognition whether they welcomed it or not. The knock on my apartment door was deliberate, persistent. I opened it to find Janet and Miranda standing there, expressions taut with a mix of indignation and disbelief. Janet's eyes narrowed. Miranda's lips pressed into a thin line. I stepped aside, letting them enter, but I stayed rooted in place. My hands unclasped on the table, my posture steady. Janet was the first to speak, her voice sharp. "Vivian, this has gone far enough. You can't just withhold support like this. Do you realize what you've done?" Miranda added, quieter but tense. "Mom, why didn't you tell me sooner?" I didn't know. I held up a hand, cutting them off. "Stop. I want to speak first, and I want you to listen." I slid the ledger, the bank statements, the screenshots of emails and messages across the table. Everything here is documented. Every payment, every utility covered, every emergency managed. For years, I've handled these responsibilities quietly, and no one ever acknowledged it. You've both assumed it would continue indefinitely, and now that it doesn't, the reaction is predictably defensive. Janet's face flushed, her voice rising. "We had no idea you're overreacting." "I am not overreacting," I said firmly. "I am asserting boundaries. I am done being the invisible enabler. These payments stop here. I will no longer cover expenses that you are capable of managing yourselves. You are adults, Miranda. You need to take responsibility for your own choices, and Janet, you cannot rely on me to fix what you fail to manage." The room grew tense. Miranda opening her mouth to speak, but I held my gaze unwavering. This is not punishment. This is clarity. I am reclaiming control over my life. I will no longer allow my efforts to be exploited or dismissed. You will feel the consequences of your actions, and you will adjust accordingly. The shift was palpable. For the first time, the power in this relationship was balanced differently. Janet's anger flickered into silence. Miranda's hesitation into realization. I breathed steadily, letting the moment settle, knowing that the true test had only just begun. The hours after the confrontation stretched into a tense quiet. My phone buzzed repeatedly, each notification a mixture of anger, concern, and disbelief from family members. Aunt Laura sent a message condemning my actions, calling it extreme and unnecessary. Uncle Henry lectured on loyalty, insisting that family should weather conflicts together. Miranda's texts were hesitant, apologetic in tone, but laced with frustration. Janet predictably alternated between blaming me and insisting she had done nothing wrong. Amid the barrage, a few messages offered unexpected relief. Cousin Amber, who had always been more perceptive, acknowledged the pattern I had endured and commended me for finally taking control. A neighbor, who had quietly observed the family dynamic for years, expressed admiration for the way I stood my ground. Their words were small but significant reminders that not everyone in my life was caught in the same blind devotion that had enabled the imbalance for so long. Sitting at the kitchen table, I let the wave of responses settle. The chaos around me was a reflection of the disruption I had introduced, but also of the clarity I had gained. I had spent decades minimizing myself, smoothing over conflicts, and absorbing the disappointments of being overlooked. Today was different. Today, my voice mattered. My actions were deliberate, and my boundaries were clear. The satisfaction that came with that recognition was tempered by the knowledge that some relationships might never fully recover. Yet the relief of stepping out from the role of perpetual caretaker, of finally valuing my own needs and asserting them, outweighed any lingering guilt. I had learned that self-respect was not dependent on approval, that acknowledgement from others could never replace the certainty of knowing I had done right by myself. I closed my laptop after responding to the supportive messages, breathing in the calm that followed the storm. For the first time in years, I felt the quiet weight of empowerment settle over me, steady and resolute. The next step was mine to shape unhurried and unafraid. I woke the next morning with a quiet sense of purpose. For the first time in years, my birthday felt like mine, entirely unshadowed by obligation or expectation. I made a simple breakfast and poured a cup of coffee, savoring the warmth, the aroma, the normalcy. There was no tension in the apartment, no hidden expectations, no unspoken demands waiting to pull me into old patterns. By mid-morning, I was on the phone with a few friends I had long neglected, scheduling a small lunch at our favorite downtown cafe. Laughter came easily unguarded and full-bodied, the kind that made my chest feel lighter than it had in decades. We shared stories, reminisced about the past, and celebrated with no interruptions, no comparisons, and no shadows of family favoritism looming over the table. Sitting there, I reflected on the weeks that had passed the confrontation, the halted payments, the flurry of messages, and the way I had finally asserted my boundaries. I felt the weight of years lifted, replaced with clarity, self-respect, and a quiet joy that had nothing to do with recognition from others. For once, I was the center of my own life, and the acknowledgement I sought was internal, unwavering, and entirely mine. The day stretched on with small, deliberate choices. A walk through the lakefront, a stop at the bookstore I loved, a call to a cousin who had always been quietly supportive. Each moment reinforced a simple truth. Autonomy was not selfish, and self-recognition was not indulgent. I had learned that protecting my own peace and valuing my contributions was more important than appeasing the ungrateful or maintaining appearances. As evening settled, I returned to my apartment and looked out over the city skyline, lights twinkling against the darkening sky. This birthday was a beginning, a declaration that life at 64 could be different, that my choices mattered, and that I had the right to shape my days according to my own needs and desires. The past would always be a part of me, but the future, my future, was firmly in my hands.